and I'm now going to start the recording. Okay, so it's a huge pleasure to see so many of you here to welcome our wonderful speaker, Louisa Jones. As I said, I'm sitting in the Ideas Cartel. It's a place called the Ideas Cartel, which is a co-working space, and I can't think of a better place to welcome Louisa to talk. I'm delighted because it's our first lady, our first woman speaker of the year, which is going to have to be remedied next year for sure. Louisa grew up born and raised in Canada. She moved to the south of France in 1975, where she began to garden. And trying to learn to garden, she started to visit. Can you please all mute yourselves? Please mute yourself. Sorry. She started to visit gardens, and that led to her first publication in 1992 of a book called Gardens in Provence. Since then, she's published 30 titles in French, English, in France, UK, and US. And sorry, I'm being interrupted. Please mute yourselves.
Oh, that's not nice here.
Angela, why don't you just mute everybody and then start?
Yeah. Yes.
Not me.
I've muted everybody. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. And Louisa, you must unmute yourself.
Right.
Okay, so Louisa, you and I have the floor. So let me just finish. So this is her 31st title. It's called Garden Wilding, or Le Jardin Ensauvagé. And that will actually be being presented in Rome for anybody of the Italian branch who happen to be in Rome at the Stendhal bookshop on the 16th of November. So if you want to go along and meet Louisa in person, if you're lucky to be a Roman cittadino, that will be available to you. So Louisa, if you'd like to share your screen now, thank you so much for being with us. And I'm looking forward to this wonderful presentation.
Okay, is that clear? Does that come through? Okay.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm very surprised to be here. I'm very happy to be talking to you all, but I'm kind of surprised because I thought I had retired some years ago. I wasn't intending to write any more books, but of course I do keep up with what people are doing. And I noted with some interest the fashion for wilding and rewilding. And I noticed that it happens differently in Britain and in France and in the US. And in France, it's appealed mostly to social scientists, to historians, to scientists and historians of science too, but also philosophers. And a lot of them are working on field work, and they're very much naturalists. One of the best books to come out is about bird life and how birds organize their societies. Very interesting things. But a lot of them are publishing with the same person, same company that I publish with, Actes Sud. And I said to my publisher, with whom I've remained friends, I said, why don't these people ever write about gardens? They're all interested in the relationship of people to the land, to the earth, to the planet, and how people live and how people interact with the planet. And many of them, it seemed to me, have paragraphs in their writing, which could very well apply to gardens and gardening. And so the publisher said, well, you write that book. So that's how I got back into this. And I started to explore. It was great fun. I enjoyed very much. I went all over the place. I learned all sorts of things I read many, many books, and I consulted a lot of people. So it's kind of like a giant reporting effort. I acted much like a reporter and a researcher. And finally, I discovered that really this main issue of how human beings relate. I went Here's the cover of the book itself, in fact, which has a photographer, the photograph is by Olivier Philippi. The model that I found for wilding that I liked best of the various things was the one by Isabella Tree, whom of course we heard a lot about last year, in the last lecture from Tom Stewart Smith. And the reason that I really liked her version of it is that it includes human beings. Many of the efforts at wilding and rewilding by conservationists in fact exclude human life entirely. And we now know, in fact, that organisms, living beings don't simply exist as independent entities in an environment, but everything is changing all the time. And that what we call the environment is something which is in fact created constantly by the interdependencies of different living beings on each other. So Isabella Tree uses that approach, and she includes humans as part of the interdependency, as part of the web of life. And of course, she's interested in farming. And so it turns out that going all around all these various inquiries, I ended up back in the Mediterranean, and that was rather a surprise to me, and I think maybe to some other people, because most of the people who write about wilding and rewilding are writing about northern forests and rushing rivers and wilderness and so on, and the Mediterranean seems to be such an area where people have lived for so long. But that's what I'm going to talk to you about. My last book that I thought was the last book was this book, Manifesto for Mediterranean Gardens, which has an edition in English published in Australia, but not available in the US, I think. And Dan Pearson wrote a preface, a foreword for that. And the way he saw it, what I was writing about, was a dialogue between a place and being part of it, a way forward that we should all be thinking about, one that draws upon the ethos of living within one's means and using the garden to connect wholeheartedly with the places we live in. And I believe that that is an important element about Mediterranean gardening, that we have a very good heritage in this regard, that we're in danger perhaps of losing or forgetting a little bit the relationship of people to places and the specifics of places, the local characteristics of places, and that gardens are not planting schemes that you can simply write down and take from one place to another and remove whatever is there and just to replace it with whatever you happen to draw on your table, which I did try to do at the beginning. Lots of us did sit down over the kitchen table and try to make planting schemes. But I think we need now to have a slightly different approach. Some old and new sources, the biological diversity in space and time. This is one of the best books on Mediterranean region as a reference book. It is written by a team of scientists working in Montpellier, but it was published in Oxford and by Oxford University Press. And it is one of the best reference books for the ways in which species evolve, coevolution from the beginnings of life in the Mediterranean, including human beings. And it's very rich. And it's the last edition, unfortunately, was in 2012. I hope they'll do a new edition. But the book that I wrote recently is similar to Dave Goulson's book, The Garden Jungle, or Gardening to Save the Planet, because it now seems to be more and more the case that our choices in gardening don't only involve ourselves, but are really become very important. Not just a question of I like this style or I like that style, but a question of what difference we can make. And in that regard, I discovered something that really knocked me over. It turns out that the area covered by gardens, I have statistics on this for the UK and for France, and that seems to be possibly the case also in the US, that there's a much greater area covered by gardens and by nature reserves. I'm not talking about natural parks. Parks are very big and they include all kinds of things like towns and cities and so on. But the areas that are set aside as nature reserves that are supposed to protect species and biodiversity and so on are shrinking. And the area covered by gardens is growing, and it's growing constantly. So what we do as gardeners really matters. It really makes a difference. And it's like, it's good to just keep that in mind, I think. Now, it turns out that I am somewhat at odds with the prevailing view in British horticulture, as you saw it in the last lecture. And I have been, it turns out, since my very first book, because when I began writing about gardens in Provence, I started visiting in the 70s and the 80s, and everybody told me then already that there were no gardens in Provence. And there were no gardens in Provence because there were no English gardens in Provence. That's changed, of course, a lot. But in those days in France, the magazines were just beginning to show, photography had just developed into lush pictures. And all of the French gardening magazines, many of which were born at that time, were showing lovely pictures of English gardens. And the people that I was meeting who had gardens, I saw about 200 gardens for my first book. But inevitably the owners would say, "Oh, that's a cherry orchard. No, that's a hedge. That's a windbreak. That's as if it had some practical use, it was considered, it couldn't possibly be a garden, because gardening had to be ornamental. It had to be decorative. It had to be non-utilitarian. And of course, everything that I was seeing had some reason for being, some practical reason for being, just like old farmhouses do. So that was the first thing that I discovered. Use and beauty, and that is an old Roman tradition that goes right back to antiquity. Mainly flowers, mainly herbaceous plantings, mainly in the summer, reasonably enough given the climate differences. Whereas, of course, a lot of things go dormant in the summer here and grow all winter. Fruit and foliage and seed are, as well as, and I would even say roots, are count as much in plants in the Mediterranean as do flowers. The main appeal of the English model is visual, and I think this is still the case. There's a chapter in my book called "From the Picturesque to the Photogenic," the importance of television and of photography in people making gardens that will photograph well and that will be pictures. This is still, I think, the main aesthetic. Whereas in gardens in the Mediterranean, it's very difficult sometimes to get a good picture because they're all around you. And in the summer, you have to have a roof, you have to have shade. So there has to be something over your head. There are extreme contrasts of light and shade. But we do have the tremendous advantage of terracing and hillside terracing, which allows you to be intimate on the one hand, and at the same time, have views out on the outside world. Views on the outside world are different too, I think, in the two models, because frequently it's sociologists all agree that industrialization took place in Britain 100 years before France, and northern France is far more industrial than the Mediterranean world for various historic reasons that I won't go into now. But as a result, it's much easier to have open farmland, or simply open unbuilt up land in the south than in the north. And of course, there are many exceptions, but still the whole relationship to the surrounding, what's outside the garden, can be very different. And of course, the way you move through the garden, that's different too. If you have courtyards or enclosed spaces, or spaces that, if you have a mixed border along a lawn, you walk along the lawn or along a path, and you look at a series of pictures as you go. And the garden is designed as a series of pictures. Whereas in a Mediterranean garden, often it's much more irregular, and the transitions are handled differently and so on. And one of the things, of course, that makes this different too, is that the vegetation has to be layered in a Mediterranean garden. There has to be shade. There has to be, and you have these wonderful evergreen shrubs that are so resilient, that are so numerous and have flower at so many different times of year, that are resilient, as I say, to fire, to sheep, to floods, and even to human pruning. And some of them really live much better if they get pruned. So, like fruit trees, so they tend to be the backbone often of the garden. And for some of the English designers, of course, shrubs are considered very boring. Finally, I would say in general terms, the British horticulture has developed as a form, an art form, a very refined art form, I think, with great distinction. And I've always thought I came to this area of inquiry and effort as an art historian and a professor of literature. I've always considered that gardens were art. Never had any doubt about that. And certainly horticulture has made a great range of types of art. But I think in the Mediterranean, the evolution of knowledge about plants has been much more close to botany. It's also been linked to medicinal purposes. Many of the great botanical gardens were linked to schools of medicine. Ethnobotany, the relationship between humans and plants and what different uses, the whole idea of foraging. Plants were part of everyday life and commonplace and had multiple uses. And it didn't mean that their beauty was not appreciated, but the domestic and the wild are far more closely interrelated. There's not the sense of culture versus nature is much stronger in the north than it is in the south. Of course, the English model, I say English, it is of course British, but the term English is always used is generally used, le jardin anglais in French, but it's transposable to climates around the world as it was since the late 19th century and through the 20th century, and often imposed in countries where the climates made it very difficult to maintain. You know the old joke about wherever there's an Englishman, there's a garden, and wherever there's two Englishmen, there's three gardens, because each of them will have a garden, and then they have a club, and the club will have a garden. So that certainly was actually true, I think, in many places. Whereas in the Mediterranean, which remained a poor area, basically poor in terms of having extra resources, the first principle of any garden was climate management. And we can learn from that today. You have windbreaks and sunscreens and all of these water management. These are all things that are becoming more important throughout the world. And the Mediterranean has millennia of experience with that. So that's how I started off. Since I learned in the Mediterranean, I learned my gardening. I didn't, in spite of my name, where people think always, oh, well, she must be British. But I'm a modest Canadian, I'm afraid. So I'm not going to run through that whole range of Mediterranean things. My books are about it, and some of you heard me lecture before. I don't want to repeat too much, but I really want to insist on the olive tree as a great symbol, because it is so varied in its ways of existing, and at the same time so universal. And it is such a wonderful example of what can be beautiful and useful at the same time, and also all year round. So here's a February photograph from Heidi Gildemeister's garden in Mallorca, where she has her husband had sheep grazing behind the bedstead, which in fact has electric wires as well. And in the sheep garden, things grew like the Euphorbia dendroides, which the sheep won't eat. But she has these wonderful old olive trees. And on the French Riviera, there are also very old olive trees. This is a garden belonging to an English publisher, and it is a designer garden. Is it a garden or not? It's an agricultural landscape in which the santolinas have been placed in the right way. And of course, this is the crop. This is the nets that are laid out to catch the fruit in December. Use in beauty, again, the olive trees used by various artists. Ian Hamilton Finlay, as you may know, has a garden in Navarro, in Provence, made a garden at the end of his life, in which the olive groves are very important symbols of antiquity, with the pseudo-Greek temple. On the right-hand side, something completely different, which is the German painter Peter Clausen using the olive trees that were already there, and the stone lines that were already there, but which appealed to him because of the abstraction of the landscape. And he was very drawn by the shadows that were cast. Nicole de Vision at the Clos Pascal in Provence was very, brought out the silver side of the olive trees and the richness, the depth of the foliage. It almost looks as if they were in flower. And the shapes and forms by Marc Nussera on the, I don't think those trees are very productive, but they make wonderful characters. And I put in this quotation from Renoir. The olive tree follows the weather, sad when the sky is gray, sonorous by sunlight and silvery in the wind. And one final type of the hat to the olive trees. The garden, many gardens, as you see, I've been showing you artist gardens and gardens by very sophisticated and aware people who make the most of what is already on the spot. Here's on the right-hand side is an anonymous artist, if you like. It's a farmer in the Gara who's just rebuilt his stone walls. And I put that in, and also the picture down on the left to show the relationship, to remind us, you all know this already, but the relationship between the mineral elements and the vegetation in Mediterranean gardens. And here we have such different scale. I think the importance of the variety which olive trees lend themselves to is also indicative of the importance of different, things can be the same and very different at the same time. And scale is one of the variables. So here's this quite small farmer's garden. Down below is the Rothschild garden in Corfu with these huge rocks. And this again looks as if it were layers of time, and there's geological layers, certainly, the farming thing, but in fact, it's a garden that was designed by Mary Keane. And of course, at the top is one where the mineral layer completely disappears, and you have a very contemporary meadow, which is part of the wild garden of the Italian designer, Paolo Pedroni. Now, one of the things that makes this sense of place so important and is the farming heritage. And the farming heritage in the Mediterranean is small family farms, and which are often described, even historians, even the most rigorous scientific historians, often speak of them as gardens. And one of the reasons they do, I think the reasons that they do have to do with the internal diversity, the amount, and the fact the diversity comes from the fact that the geological fragmentation around the Mediterranean created many small microclimates, and the geological variation from 1 kilometer to the next is much greater than it is in Northern Europe. And so that you have this Ager, Saltus, and Silva, the scrubland, the Saltus, the Ager, the cultivated land, and the woodland are often always intermingled in some way, so that you don't have Peter Wohlleben in his famous book on trees. There's a place I marked where he's very contemptuous of Mediterranean trees. He says they're all just brush. It's all just brushland. But he's right that there's not the great Germanic forest that you are afraid to go into, because it's all humanized. It's all part of something that human beings know and love, and it's also a resource for human survival. In poor small farms, everything counted, so you had to make the most of all the possible resources. And the other thing that made them seem like gardens is not just the diversity and the variety and the mixture. Some people speak of a moving mosaic, in the Mediterranean world, but it's also the care and the love that human beings often, again, if you live in the same place and you depend on it for survival, you may hopefully at any rate come to love it. Climate management, just one example of this, just to remind us, because again, it's something you all know, I think, but how it works in all seasons, how necessary it is, but also how beautiful it is. And on a big farm, this is a fine old Provençal farm, which has these wonderful plane trees, which probably dated from 17th or 18th century. And they were so placed so that they would shade the farmstead in the full summer and let the sun in the winter, and that's the basic principle. But they also involve all this layered vegetation, and some of it is very formal, and some of it is inside here in the center area underneath the trees is a kind of playground for the children, which is quite very wild and full of wildflowers. And here, this is a picture that I love. It's a great memory of a person that I admired. And she had a very small courtyard, and she had managed it in such a way that the trellising is pruned and just enough to let there be sunshine where you sit and to let the light come in on the oleander. So even in midsummer, it's a lovely mixture of sun and shade, and just the right amount for everybody. I think that's one of the principles that I've discovered of garden wilding is interaction between species so that everybody benefits, so that everybody's happy. The oleander is happy, the gardener is happy, and it creates a genuine well-being in which life flourishes. Now here's a counterexample, and I don't think anybody would do this anymore now. This was 1990, and it was Sir Terence Conrad's proud garden at the time. And he was keen to have something that reminded him of Tuscan villas. And he trusted too much, I think, local advice. That was maybe a little bit cynical. And he developed his garden along the whole north slope of his farmstead. The most beautiful thing is the trees on the south side, the chestnut trees. There's a slope up away from the farmstead, and the Mistral wind comes down into that house like nobody's business. It's just the design funnels the wind right into the house, which is of course the opposite of climate management. There are many things there too that I could comment on. The stone walls are not done in the local style, and they have no reason for being there. There's no useful purpose there at all, so they look perfectly just plaqué. I don't know what the word is in English, just stuck onto the land. The lawn is with the fruit trees in it. It's not going to be the same conditions for growing, and the jars were brought in from Crete because everybody felt that concrete esplanade looked a little bare and unfriendly. And I often took people to visit that garden, and I several times took the English gardening school there. And I remember Rosemary Alexander, with whom I like very much. I haven't seen her for a while, but she said, as we walked in with the group one day, the first time she went there, she looked at it and she said, "This would look really good on paper." And I thought, yes, it looks really good on paper, but who would want to live there? But so part of what I'm talking about in Mediterranean gardening is creating conditions in which everybody wants to live. All of the species that you welcome, the trees, the plants, and so on, and the fauna as well. Some fauna, and formal and wild, not opposites. That has to do with the mineral elements and with the evergreen. And here are several examples. The first one at the upper right is a village that was an abandoned village, was bought by an architect from Nice in the 90s, and she chose to turn it into a giant sculpture. She restored some of the buildings, some of them she left as ruins. She shows off some of the bare rock, and she didn't plant anything. She simply clipped what was there, and she made it's a stunning place. It's not this, I have to admit, it's not a very useful place in any way, except for an architect. But it is a wonderful sculpture. On the left-hand side is a strange story. It's a Parisian couple who bought a Bastide near Aix. You can see it at the top of the picture, just the balustrade. And they had this hillside with an old garden. They didn't know exactly what was there. And they had been told that Scottish gardeners were the best gardeners in Europe. So they imported a Scottish gardener who didn't speak any French, and they didn't give him any budget at all. and they just told him to turn it into a garden. And what could he do? The whole hillside was covered with the same plants that were growing outside. It was growing with viburnum tinus, with broom, and with boxwood. And so he created what he called shapes. He clipped, and it was quite stunning too. It was, but it was on this spot that I realized that this continuum between the wild rock on the which was outside the garden in this case, the stone walls and the balustrade, the degree of human intervention was always experienced. Similarly for the plants, then the wild boxwood outside, the hedges, and then the shapes. The movement towards art was not an opposition between nature and culture. It was a continuum moving. The more humans intervene, the more it seems to human beings to be art. But in fact, it's and it wasn't in this case, or nor in this case, destructive to the life of the place. And the best example of that, of course, is Nicole de Vésion's garden in La Louve, of which I've written quite a lot. I won't go on a lot about that either, but when John Brooks visited that, he considered it a wild garden. And partly because of the relationship between the hillside, always we're talking here about the relationship between the wild and the domestic, the wild and how it has been interpreted and used by human beings. And this is, of course, what Olivier Philippi does as well. He does it with rig plants. He doesn't do it with this wonderful enchanting contrast between pale limestone and dark shrubbery. Olivier has another range of colors and so on. But for him, has always said the pruning is like what sheep do, or the wind, or salt air. Humans do it, and so does all kinds of other natural forces. It doesn't make us different from sheep or salt air or wind or whatever. And to give you a real sample of what people, I always object when people call it topiary, what Nicole de Vésion does, for example. This is an example from Gilles Clément's garden near Paris. He was one of the leaders in the early type of ecological gardening, and we'll see more of him throughout, because he certainly was a model for me and for many people who began in the 70s and 80s already. This is in his garden. At one point, he was roundly denounced that he couldn't possibly be ecological, really, because he clipped, because he cut one of his shrubs. It was a shrub that was there, and he thought it set off the wildflowers around it better if he made it into a formal shape. So he had no qualms about doing that. He never called himself an ecologist anyway. Everybody else did. But so he wasn't disturbed by that at all. One of the things he did too, which later became quite famous, and now lots of people do, was to mow, which he used a hand mower, of course, not an electric mower, in such a way as to let the wildflowers spread and to leave a clump in the middle if it happened to be there. The paths would change from year to year according to whatever spontaneous vegetation appeared. Now, the difference between that and topiary seems to me obvious. This is another wonderful garden, which in some ways is a wild garden, Priona in the Netherlands. And Henk Gerritsen was one of the pioneers, as you know, I think probably with Piet Oudolf, and one of the people that started what was called naturalistic gardening. But there's no doubt that when he made chickens and ducks, he was making chickens and ducks. He wasn't trying to create. I mean, it's a whole different approach. The Vésion and Clément are taking their inspiration from the natural shape of the shrub as it is. Here we're imposing a shape from the outside for fun, but Henk had this wonderful expression of playing, the gardening was playing with nature. And I think that still holds firm. He was a very knowledgeable ecologist too, actually. Garrick Gardens, I'm not going to go on about that because you've heard a lot about that already from your other speakers. Just to remind you that the version of Olivier's garden, Thomas Doxiadis in Greece, and James Basson. One of the things I have noticed, however, and I saw a video that was made by the editors of the Spanish magazine, Verde es Vida, I think it's called, about the contemporary Spanish design. And I thought the colors were very bright. And that's something that maybe a sort of blending between the English summer garden and the Mediterranean. I think the colors in most of the garrigues have bright spots, but they tend to be more like Thomas's garden here. Now, moving right along. Olivier, I have to quote from Olivier. The romantic landscape from which the lawn-based garden model arose is organized around a static scene which imitates an idealized nature. Well, when we look at Mediterranean landscape with a gardener's eye, we may start to conceive of a garrigue garden as an ecosystem, the transformation of which the gardener can guide over the years, and in doing so, bring its dynamic evolution closer to the workings of the landscape that inspired it. So here's the crux. I think that the contrast between the British model that I heard in your last lecture and in Noel Kingsbury's lectures is this model, a static scene which imitates an idealized nature. That would be, for me, a definition of the naturalistic, but it doesn't involve process. What Olivier is recommending is an ecosystem, not a planting scheme. And an ecosystem has a past and a future. It evolves through time and it takes time, the transformation of which the gardener can guide over the years. It's dynamic evolution, closer to the workings of the landscapes that inspire it. So it's something that you get involved in. I don't remember, I meant to put this in this lecture somewhere. I don't remember if I did or not, but one of the French philosophers talks about Bruno Latour, who just died last week, unfortunately. He has a book called Coming to Earth. And one of his images that I use and that I liked a lot is stepping off the curb into the parade. The first is like standing on the sidewalk watching the parade go by. And the second is getting involved in it. The stuff, you can't see the whole thing from a distance so much anymore, but you have so much richness in the connections that you have all around you as you go. And I've put in a comment from Kingsbury too. This I got from a website where he comments, designers as well as private gardeners are now likely to create blended plantings, imitating the patterns of plants in natural environments, but he's still involved in how things look. It still looks and not process. So I think that's probably the shift that I'm trying to present to you. It also involves things like biodiversity is not just a plant list. It's interdependencies, it's interactions, that sort of thing. So now I'm leaving what the Mediterranean garden as I had described it in previous ways, and going into the new book and some of the things that I recommended as Wilding the Gardener, discovery. I did put it in Step Off the Curb, Join the Parade. And one of the people that I quote a lot and like a lot in their work is
Breeder Daly, please be quiet. Mute yourself.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought we were all muted.
You are all muted.
Okay.
Carry on.
Véronique Muir had, with her husband, made this wonderful Jardin de la Bigoterie in the Dordogne. And she wrote a small book about it. And this is just one quote from her book, but I quote quite a lot of other things in my new book. Ignorant or unkind visitors may claim that this is not really a garden. However, the patient reconstitution of plant groups, gradual normalization of the nitrogen content of soils that are too rich, the removal of part of the most invasive plants for the benefit of the most timid, the selecting and spreading of favored seeds, all of these tasks are not part of ordinary horticulture, perhaps, but they are undeniably gardening. And they are things that she did in order to make the most, again, making the most of what you already have, learning what you already have, studying what you already have, and then enriching it and organizing it, perhaps directing it, like an orchestra conductor, perhaps, or what she does, the whole business of soil, removing topsoil to put down gravel. It seems to me really an artificial thing. If you want, what she did in order to gradual normalization of the nitrogen content of soils was simply to, and I think Isabella Tree did that in some parts, to mow and then remove the hay and do that over several seasons or several mowings so that the soil gradually itself loses its, stops enriching. Now, it's kind of fun if you think of the human being, the human gardener then becomes a person with a species with a territory. You're one species among other species, and you have this territory, which is your garden. And it's your garden, and you're going to make sure that it's your territory. You're going to decide what. I'm not suggesting that people stand back and let everything happen. I mean, gardeners have very personal relationship with the spaces that they occupy. So you have a right to have your habitat and your trails like the other species. On the other hand, it's kind of humbling when you think that that land, whatever the property rights you have, it doesn't really belong to you because something happened, lots of things happened there before you came, and lots of things are going to happen afterwards. If you're lucky, if you do play your cards right, a lot of things will keep happening there after you left. So there's this layering in time element, which is very important. And here's a Moroccan village, which is so beautifully set into its environment. I should stop saying that because we don't do that anymore. It's not setting in an environment, it's interacting with its environment. And then here, the interaction is clear because all of the soil has been used to build the houses, basically. In the ruins of the St. Abbey and Arabic garden, these are 12th, or I think they're actually 8th century tombs. And of course, you can include and recognize Marc Nussera when he began sculpting trees in Provence after he was an agricultural worker to start off with. But he managed to convince many of the people, of his clients, to leave their cypress hedging because he made fretwork out of it and turned them into sculpture. Otherwise, many of his clients were just ready to rip up all the hedging on old cypresses. So this idea of making do with what you have. On the other hand, here's someone who started from scratch. That's a botanist living in Western France. And he made everything from scratch. The inside is a large round room, which is very elegant, somewhat minimalist, with lots of room for various activities. And the whole garden is on the rest of the garden is on the hillside in front. So the human species, subspecies gardener marks its territory also with trails and paths, often incorporating the paths as well. This is Pascal Cribier imitating Roman roads with a Filippi style planting. In Greece, this is Thomas Doxiadis again, making the roads in such a way that from a distance you'll just see stone walls. It'll seem like terracing. And then the easiest way of all at the Mas de Benoit is simply mowing different heights, which is something everybody can do. And then the whole business of deciding the limits of your territory. Now, the woman who wrote the book on bird life claims that birds' territory is not defensive. It's not a space to be defended against the outside world. It's space occupied by a society in a convivial way. I think that's really interesting definition of territory. So you can do that too, of course, and it's a nice way to think about gardening. But often you want to have some connections. And as I said before, terracing allows you this wonderful combination of intimacy and opening. And this is three gardens which are all on terraces. In the Greek example, the constraints, the climate constraints are quite extreme. The wind is really fierce, but the views are really fantastic too. Immersion, texture, multiple viewpoints, changing light. All of these are things that you're far more aware of when you're reacting to the garden with your whole body and not just your eyes. And you're observing. You have an enhanced attention to everything that's around you. Here's an old garden, and it's in Paris, but it can happen in Paris too. This is a roof garden by Camille Miller, and the wall here is the wall that separates his roof from the neighbors. And he planted it inspired by his grandmother's garden in Alsace. And it will have wonderful colors in the autumn when the vine changes. And my point in including it here is that it's a view looking down. It's a plunging view, even in a very small space. Whereas over here, we have a view looking up into treetops with the, and this is something which is planned for seasonal development, but on the right, it's just a moment, in an accidental moment in time when the cotinus foliage opens and the new berberis foliage right at the same time as the Judas tree is in flower. And it doesn't happen like that every year. And it just happened that it's at, but you have to be looking up at the right time to catch it. This is a more of a meadow type picture. In fact, this is a picture of a vegetable garden, but which has been somewhat invaded by this Verbena bonariensis. And the reason I put it in here is that it's you have to be practically on your knees to have this view. And it's really interesting to think of all the fashion for meadows where people are standing or sitting or kneeling or lying down when they take the pictures that they take of meadows, and how you whether it's a plunging view or across the, and it's very difficult for books that involve a lot of meadow photography to know how to determine the boundaries. Usually there's a house or there's a screen, like a hedging, there's a row of trees at the end. That it's how do you determine the form and the shape? So but in a wild garden, it's not the point. It doesn't have to be form and shape. It can be just momentary immersion or durable immersion. And here's a momentary thing, which is very ordinary jasmine, but which just happens to have the light on it at just the right time, at just the right moment. And you can enjoy that moment of contrast of sun and shade. Happy accidents managed by gardeners. This again is Nicole de Vision, who was inspired by the autumn color of a vineyard in the distance, and managed to find sumacs that would flower, that would turn color at just the right time and just the right echoing. Here's a vine that ought to have been pruned, that wasn't, and the Perovskia simply spread by itself, and the echinopes were self-sown. Self-sowing is obviously a big resource in garden wilding. And here is a completely accidental planting of 3 species that found the same crack between 2 stones. The most important point to make, perhaps, is about soil. If we could, and I can't show you that in pictures, it's all microscopic, and we now know, and again, the last 10 years have been so rich in research on this topic, of what happens in the soil, the various organisms that proliferate, how they relate to plant roots, how they feed plants. If we could, and these are 2 very different scientists who come to the same conclusion. If we could restore just 4% of the planet's soil each year by adding organic matter, we would quickly redress the carbon balance to pre-industrial levels. You hear people talk about planting trees all the time. Excuse me. All the time people talk about planting trees, but what about restoring the soil? And it seems that it would be so good for so many people in so many ways. The regeneration of degraded soils would provide a relatively simple means, one with multiple positive effects for resolving the world's major problem today. And when I hear people talk about removing their topsoil and to replace it with gravel, I must admit that I think, well, isn't there another way? Can't we do this differently? And this is, again, I repeat, what happens in gardens matter. Gardens matter. How you treat your soil is really important. Now, I put this in a bit of a joke, really, but it's a teasing. Berchigonge is a garden in the Vosges department in France, northeastern, close to Alsace. And apparently it's a place that Noel Kingsbury goes to regularly, and he has told them it's his favorite garden, though he may say that to all the garden owners. But I just thought I would put it in because I recently saw again the owners of this garden, and we were talking about wilding. And it turns out that most of the things that I recommend in my book for wilding are things that they have been doing for 30 years. And they really have They are also great horticulturalists. They have, among other things, 850 varieties of narcissus. So if you want to see plant collections, this garden is very, very rich in plant collections, but it's full of fantasy and it's full of spontaneity. And they sometimes have sought for years to find just the place where individual plants or typical or species will be happiest. It's a garden where everybody works together to try for maximum vitality and dynamism, and I highly recommend it. And here is one of the garden of Gilles Clément, which, as I say, was the model that began really in the 1970s and 1980s to inspire ecological gardening in France. And I think this quotation is very apt. He says, "The beauty experienced does not come from the adjustment of forms, simple design or know-how, but from a living ensemble that interweaves humans with plants, animals, sound, and lights." That he wrote that already in the 1980s. But I think that's pretty much what garden wilding is still about today. And I allowed myself last word. These are quotations. I hope I can read it all behind the photographs. "Human intervention in the fabric of life is not always harmful." Remember, I said at the beginning that the philosophers were so concerned whether humans were just a parasite on the planet and that everything we do is destructive. And garden wilding lets us experience this in the most immediate and personal way possible, day by day. When you work in your garden in a way that makes it possible for life to flourish, that for the greatest variety of life forms to flourish, you are proving this. Wilded gardeners not only contribute, we enjoy enormous privileges. We can go far beyond just assembling plants to make pretty pictures after wiping out everything on site in favor of some borrowed image or preconceived plan. I wonder who I was thinking of there. This approach leaves room for slowing down, for shared playfulness, for unexpected encounters. The whole idea of encounters is really important on the everyday basis. For trying out dreams, for experimentation, regenerating the conditions that let life flourish, including our own, means more than just protection. And many gardeners get to do this every day. We're so lucky. In societies where children often grow up with no direct experience of the living non-human world, it happens all the time now. I see evidence. Isabella Tree writes a great deal about that too in her book. Children grow up with no direct experience of the living non-human world. We enjoy regular immersion in the constantly changing web of life. And more and more often we share it, and I'm not going into that here, but in the book I do go on to things like permaculture and agroecology and ways in which, and collective gardening, other ways in which the same principles are applied in larger contexts. So that's it. That's the end. I shall go back now. Stop.
Thank you.
There we go. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, Louisa. I'm now trying to get everybody back on the gallery view, which is not, but it's not, why? I can only see Lindsay and Angela and Louise. It's crazy today. Something is going on. Right. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm trying to get you all back because I'd like to see you all. And
But we can see ourselves.
no, I can't. Oh God. Yes, George. Hello. You'd like to make a question?
Well, first of all, Louisa, I just want to say how terrific it is to hear this wonderful presentation from you. It's extremely valuable, very important, and you've done a wonderful job as always. But for you, and I want to come, all of us can see everybody. Maybe you can't, but all of us, I think, can.
Yeah, but as I'm the facilitator, that's what I need to do.
That's right.
I have no idea.
If people,
here I go. I've sorted it out. Sorry, it's just one of those days. I'm fine. I'm back. I'm back with everybody. So hello to everybody.
I just want to say, if people put up their hand through the device below on the bottom of the
Yeah.
screen to raise your hand, it'll come to the front so you can see them.
Exactly. So, Louisa, thank you again. Let's start and see if anybody would like to ask you questions.
I see there's a discussion.
So
At
I
the
think
bottom of the
Lindsay is putting her hand up, her physical hand, not the yellow hand. Do you want to say something, Lindsay?
Please,
Yes.
can you? Yes, I'm just a bit worried about the birds, the bees and the butterflies. And would Louisa think it's cheating to plant a few extra things that you know that they like, even if they're not indigenous?
Well, I'm not too concerned about the indigenous problem, and I should have said more clearly that when I talk about interdependency of species, I'm talking about fauna as well as flora, and that the biodiversity that I'm recommending it very much includes birds and bees and butterflies and insects and snakes and frogs and hedgehogs and everybody together, including all of the organisms in the soil and mushrooms. And I think it's a great shame that so many schools of thought cut out one category of life and just depend on, even if it's just herbaceous planting or shrubs or whatever, we're all in this together. We all need each other. And certainly the birds and bees and butterflies are very important.
Right.
Yes, well, can I come back on that? Because I took over an old orange orchard that I didn't have your normal garrigue sort of south-facing Mediterranean stuff. So I do use what I've got, and I have to fight invasive native plants like mad, particularly tree seedlings. I do find that the blackbirds love Cotoneaster and Pyracantha and wild cherry. But the monarch butterflies don't come for my special stuff, milkweed for them. They've only been twice, ungrateful.
I have to pull out lots of seedling trees too. It's probably the main job I have to do in my garden is pulling out seedling trees.
Okay, Heather, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please? Heather Rosmarin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. So I've only been in the south of France once, and I was taking the train from Marseille to Paris and looking at the landscape as the train rushed by. And I noticed that in contrast to a lot of the farmland and agricultural land here in the US, there were these strips of what looked like forest, sort of breaking up the landscape. So you'd have a big field with monoculture, and then you'd have a strip of forest. And I was like, well, that's very interesting, because it looks like there's a conscious effort to provide some kind of wildlife corridor or maybe a pollinator refuge. I really didn't know the reasoning behind it, but it was very distinctive and I thought very interesting. So I was wondering, is there some kind of law or regulation in France that requires that? Or is it something farmers are doing on their own? And is it something we could model in our own gardens? For example, in mine, I'm planting, a mixture of native and Mediterranean plants because I'm in California. But I'm thinking about just, carving out a section, like a corner of the yard, and just letting it go full on native, like just a little refuge for native plants and animals, to just kind of grow wild without my messing around with it.
Well,
Appreciate your thoughts.
the question about France is not a national policy. There's a lot of different stages and so on. In the south of France, there were windbreaks, which are very important, which were cypress hedging. All over France, there has been a debate about hedgerows, which were first ripped out when industrial agriculture came in, and then now people are putting back. And the hedgerow is a wonderful thing in the garden, a mixed hedge of some kind. And even better than just letting things, I'm not myself, I talk about the problem of native, non-native in my book, but I don't want to get into that because there's no resolution. But a mixed hedge of things that are, again, you will probably get lots of blackbirds sowing sowing pyracantha everywhere. I'm afraid that you will probably get that, but you can put in far more interesting and varied things in pyracantha, but it's a really good idea. I do have a chapter on edges and transitional areas. And that sounds like what you want.
Can I ask then, Louisa, sorry, with the English version of the book, I missed the detail. It's still in progress, the negotiation, correct? It will be coming.
This is a touchy issue.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't mean
No,
to.
no, it's all right. It's an interesting, I think in this context, it's kind of interesting. I was wondering whether I should mention it or not, but the English publisher just withdrew having from the contract. And the reason given was that I am not, or I think I am not reverent enough towards British horticulture. No, I'm not kidding. That really seems to be the reason. So it's true. I'm not reverent enough to British horticulture, and I've just given you the reasons why I'm not. And so it seems that we're now looking for a new publisher.
Okay, somebody's written on the chat, can the MGS translate it?
Oh, it's translated. I translated it already. I have a
Okay.
translation.
You don't need
I wouldn't let anybody else translate it. I have
No.
to do it myself.
Okay.
So I did.
Okay,
The translation is all ready to go. I just
Okay.
have to find someone to
all
publish
right.
it. But thank you for the suggestion.
So anybody else like to ask a question? Yes, Jane Tully. Hi.
Yes. Hi, Louisa, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the talk. I'm a PhD candidate in archaeology. I'm writing about ancient Greek market gardens. And I think something I'm really grappling with is this distinction that we want to seem to make between ornament and utilitarian gardens, which is just not a factor. But I would just be curious to hear from your perspective, having looked at Mediterranean gardens in so many different areas. What do you see as the distinction between, a vernacular garden versus, a small farm? Is there a version that's just all utilitarian where we're really not talking about gardens anymore? Or just how do you deal with that distinction?
Well, it's a good question. I think that ornamental gardening is a bit like perspective in painting. It exists in one culture for a very short period of time, and the rest of the world doesn't even know about it. And I think that was true it's a non-starter. Ornamental gardening is it has, as I say, produced masterpieces. In ancient cultures, not just the market gardens, but all of the show gardens that belong to famous and great people, they all had fruit. Look at fruit trees. Look at Garden of Eden. Look at the Islamic paradise. They all produce fruit is important, or more fertility is considered really important as a model for prestige. So the whole idea of being purely ornamental is rather a bit strange. But yes, I think you're right that I don't think it meant, I wrote a lot in my book about peasant gardens, and I think that's closer. And I give an example. I used to lecture quite a bit in other countries about French gardens, because everyone always thought that French gardens were all like Versailles. And so I had a lecture that where I presented the great range of French gardens. And among them are what I call grandmother's gardens. And I once gave that lecture in New York at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens. And I talked at some length about grandmother's gardens, which are like peasant gardens and market gardens, except that it's a personal version. And afterwards, 2 students came up and talked to me, and they said their grandmothers had gardens just like that. And one of them was from Vietnam, and the other one was from Bermuda. So I think there is I do think that ornamental gardening is fairly limited historically. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
If you want to write me about anything, I'd be happy to give you any sources that might be helpful.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, anybody else popping up to the front with the yellow hand? I quite like this. Well, I think if there is nobody else speaking, I'd like to thank Louisa on behalf of all of us.
It was a great pleasure.
You know, it was such a pleasure to have time to get to know you a little bit more in person and to listen to this, as always, stimulating, intelligent, inquiring look at the way things are traditionally. And I think I can't wait for it to come out in English, because I don't know if I can do French. Maybe I will. So good luck with the book tour and the sales and finding a new publisher who doesn't require you to be reverent. Thank you all for joining tonight. And thanks to Louisa from all of us. See you next month, I hope. You too, Louisa.
Yes.
Okay.
I look forward to Dan's lecture. I'm sure
Yeah,
it will be very good.
okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Louisa.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Louisa.
Bye, everybody.
Bye to everybody.
Bye.
Best wishes.
Bye.
Happy
Thank you so much.
gardening.
It was great, Louisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I know it is.